Hey, listen now. I don't know how many of you people believe in astrology. I am a Sagittarius. The most philosophical of all the signs. But anyway, I don't believe in it. I think it's a bunch of bullshit, myself. But I'll tell you this, man. I'll tell you this. I don't know what's gonna happen, man. But I want to have my kicks before the whole shithouse goes up in flames, all right? On the wheel. Yeah, we're going to the road.
Hey everyone, this is Naomi Fry of The New Yorker here. Take my hand, we're overthinking the Doors. Today, we put the man in the front man, Jim Morrison. Jim wasn't always a sexy and mysterious rock god. And there's this picture of him from 1964 that I think about often and that I'm sort of obsessed with. In this photograph, we see Jim visiting his father on a ship that his father was a commander of. The father was an admiral in the Navy, and he was extremely strict and fit and put together. And in this picture, Jim is 21, and we see him looking over his dad's shoulder as they stand at the controls of the ship. And you can see that Jim is still a little bit chubby. He's kind of awkward. He's wearing a cardigan. That's how he was when he was growing up. Soon the hair would grow out, the leather pants would go on, the shirt would come off, and, within 7 short years, Jim would turn into first a sex symbol and then be dead, far too young. All of this is to say that Jim's persona was crafted and shaped in the crucible of the late 60s rock explosion. He wasn't, as Lady Gaga says, born this way. But whether he intended to or not, over the course of the late 1960s, Jim became the prototypical male rock god. So on this episode, we're going to be looking at the trope of the frontman, how sex and danger and poetry and art all became intertwined for Jim Morrison and his many, many fans. Men wanted to be him. Women wanted to be with him. I think that's usually said about James Bond, but I think the same applies to the so-called Lizard King. And joining me for this episode are two fantastic guests who think a lot about music and about culture and gender and the power of someone on stage under the lights fronting a band. My first guest is Natalie Merrick, who performs as Weyes. Weyes is basically her, but she often fronts a band, and she has a real theatricality to her performance when she's on stage. And she pulls from a wide range of traditions. To Natalie, her love of Jim and the Doors came kind of late and at a sort of surprising moment.
I always liked the Doors, and I just assumed everybody else did. And then when I realized so many people didn't, I actually became more obsessed with it. During the pandemic, during quarantine, being in Los Angeles, I feel like I got haunted by the Doors, and would go on Doors crawls and go to Laurel Canyon and go to the apartment and the liquor store that they used to go to.
Natalie and I are going to be joined by Amanda Petrusich, my fellow New Yorker staff writer. Amanda, to my mind, is one of the best music writers around and someone who always engages in modern music with a real sense of history and context.
I mean, being that way on stage, if you're the male lead singer of a rock band, is there still an expectation of a certain kind of sensuality, a certain kind of magnetism? Has that dissipated entirely from the culture? But it's hard for me to think, who is our Jim Morrison right now? Can that archetype still exist? Do we want it to exist? I don't know.
Amanda Petrusich and Weyes. Jim Morrison, sex, poetry, masculinity, and the modern rock frontman.
Is everybody in?
This is episode 3.
Is everybody in?
Here we go. Leather pants optional.
The ceremony is about to begin.
people, in my experience, have a variety of reaction to the Doors. It depends on their age. It depends on their gender, often. It depends on many, many factors.
Are you saying people are slamming the Doors?
I am saying people are often slamming the Doors.
And it's like, what's that about? Come on.
No, absolutely.
I know.
Absolutely. Natalie, I'm eager to hear from you. Like, what's your history with the Doors? Has it been kind of a straight shot of like love or like hate or suspicion or kind of maybe a changing feeling over time?
You know, I've always loved the Doors. And I think the use of organ and the use of crooning and, you know, a lot of the singers that I was a huge fan of, it turns out they were a huge fan of Jim Morrison. So like when I was getting into the Stooges and like the Misfits when I had my punk phase, it's like that was all pointing towards Jim. And I knew them as like a classic rock band. But like once I realized the lineage, I realized, oh yeah, this is definitely like my soul's music. I never loved, you know, the stereotypical stuff. Like I never had a Doors poster. And
that's interesting.
I wasn't until 2020. And then I got a lot of Doors posters. And then
why?
So like
what happened in 2020?
It was just like a weird pocket in time where I had the opportunity to kind of like admit that I was a super fan and dig my teeth into it a bit deeper and read more books and just get kind of like more into the philosophy behind the Doors and like why it was so cool, because there are so many people slamming the Doors and acting like they weren't cool. I was like, wait, you guys don't understand. Like this is, you know, the godfather of punk in so many ways, you know, and even more than that, like his whole thing transcends that for sure. And I was like, damn, like you totally missed it because they were the coolest.
I love that your like determined turn towards the Doors came from a kind of like oppositional energy.
Yeah.
It's a very punk rock gesture.
Absolutely.
I loved what Natalie said about that, the sort of parallel to Iggy and Danzig.
Yeah.
It does have like a countercultural energy. They're such a divisive band.
Yeah.
Which is also why this podcast is fun, Nomi.
Why do you think that is, Amanda, that they're so divisive? What is it about that?
It's a great question. This is a question that came up for me quite a bit when I was working on a piece last year about the band Fish, which is similarly divisive. And when you would press people to explain or to kind of explicate in like particular detail why they were so not just horrified, but in fact offended by the existence of this band, they would often have a hard time doing it. And I suspect people who kind of hate on the Doors maybe feel that way too. You know, they're kind of a humorless band, and I think they can be a little moody and a little meandering, and some people find the organ sound, I love the organ sound, but some people find it grating. I think they were a band, and Nomi, you and I have talked about this a little bit, they were a band I loved when I was 12 years old. And I think in part because they contained this very sort of fascinating mix of being both a little bit dopey and also kind of wildly pretentious, which is how I would describe myself at 12.
No, absolutely.
You know, it was a similar journey for me with the way that I felt about like a writer like Jack Kerouac at that age. And then later became aware that like loving Jack Kerouac was maybe sort of embarrassing. And then had like a cycle back around when I, you know, became older and kind of gave less of a shit about what was embarrassing or not, or at least felt more confident in my taste, which was like, oh, but there is also something here that's like incredibly tender and beautiful that kind of gets lost in translation a little bit.
5 to 1, baby. 1 in 5. No one here gets out alive.
Maybe both of you have sort of experienced it. You mentioned this earlier, Nomi. It is like a very gendered response. I think heterosexual men are maybe the most horrified by the Doors, if I may make a bold claim.
No, that's really interesting. Yeah, Natalie.
I would argue actually that one of the key reasons why the Doors are so misunderstood in terms of like how big of a comprehensive cultural footprint they had is all we really have now are the recordings. But the live performances and everything kind of surrounding that was so much more like, to, you know, reuse the word punk, than we can even imagine. It's like we weren't there for that, and we weren't there for that energy. And that energy was extremely, you know, kind of like deconstructionist. I don't know, it's still relevant today. So I think the artifact that people are going off of are the kind of like the classic rock recordings. And that it doesn't say everything about the whole picture. Or the Oliver Stone movie, which is like everybody loves to make fun of that movie. And that picture, like the picture of him is just like a stoner poster. So I do think that like it in the culture, some of that revolutionary or kind of like, the fact that he was more of a poet and a film student got lost, I think.
Waiting for the sun, waiting for the sun.
I wanted to kind of like maybe take us a little bit on a journey. As we all know, he was a Navy brat. They moved from place to place. He was kind of, as a child and as a teenager, based on many recollections of peers and his own words, something was kind of wrong with him. I mean, I don't know how it would be called today in today's kind of lingo of kind of like mental health and whatever
Spectrum-y?
and spectrum or whatever. Yeah, I'm not here to try to diagnose Jim Morrison after the fact, but he was certainly like didn't necessarily fit in extremely easily with his peers, and also he was kind of plump. This was also talked about much. He certainly wasn't, when he was growing up, what he later became in the time of the early Doors, which was kind of like an extremely hot, extremely magnetic, ladies' man and frontman, right? There's an interesting quote from the writer Eve Babbitt, who bedded him in 1966. She wrote about this in Esquire in 1991 when the Oliver Stone movie came out. She said, Jim Morrison had it worse than a lot of kids. He was fat and his father was a naval officer. That's kind of cutting to the chase, right? But it's interesting because like looking at this and then looking at what he became, it gave me kind of like a strange feeling about the kind of like self-fashioning of what it takes to be a frontman, a rock and roll frontman. And I'm wondering what you guys think about that as a kind of persona that is in some ways created out of kind of whole cloth.
It's an interesting question, Naomi. I'm curious, Natalie, if you think it's still a thing. I mean, you think of someone like Maddie Healy, who's kind of louche and sort of sexy and fucked up. And I don't know, maybe the sort of legacy lives on there.
I would love to bring in this book that talks a lot about this kind of transition, kind of like the late 50s, 60s into the counterculture by Ian Savonius called Supernatural Strategies for Starting a Rock Group. And he kind of talks about how it used to be pretty even. It was like women and men in music. There are female vocal groups or male vocal groups. It was pretty like neck to neck. And it wasn't this predominantly male scene. And when it became predominantly male, the men took on more feminine characteristics, which is kind of what Jim spoke about in that BBC interview.
In talking about life today, we have the business of the sexual relationship, the relationship between men and women, and we all wonder how much it has changed, the role of the man in modern life and the woman in modern life.
Well, when you look at history, it seems to be cyclical. There have been many periods in history where women were the major controlling influence in life. Matriarchal societies and all that kind of thing. And I think women are becoming increasingly important. I mean, it's a ridiculous thing to try and talk about, in such simple terms, but the influence of women is becoming more and more felt.
The evolution of like just a bunch of kids, boys and girls singing together to like the dude, embodying everybody's sexuality on stage and kind of sidelining women to like groupie status. That kind of created, I think, the male frontman as we think of it now, which is like not this extremely masculine presence. And what's so funny is Pamela DeBar, who was like a famous groupie, wrote this incredible book where she talked about sleeping with Waylon Jennings and just being like, he's such a man, like, whoa. And it's like,
I know.
So it's like,
I remember this so well. Yeah. So she was used to these kind of hippy dippy, you know, like
Yeah.
Chris Hillman from The Byrds and like Noel Redding from the Jimi Hendrix Experience. And then Waylon was country. And he was like, you like that long hair and everything, you know, like
Yeah, yeah.
his sort of macho sense of what a man is was very different from someone like Jim Morrison, for instance, who was masculine, but you're right, like the kind of what you're saying about the Svenonius book, the taking on of like female characteristics is such an interesting idea. What do you think that was about?
I think in some ways that was happening across the board as like they were rebelling against kind of the patriarchy in some ways, even though it was still incredibly misogynistic in the counterculture, like getting in touch with kind of the earth mama. And I love that there's just something hearkening back to kind of like a more ancient idea of like what a man could be. And yeah, growing your hair out, losing that weight, like kind of being a little out there that way. To me, that's all kind of filling the void for maybe the lack of women that were on stage.
Can we all pick our favorite, who we think is the most hottest Jim Morrison? Mugshot Jim Morrison has got to be.
Yeah, wanted
high on the list.
wanted in the county of Dade. It's no coincidence that was one of, when I was growing up, that was one of the most popular posters, you know, like the mugshot from 1969 from the Miami concert, where it says the sort of old-timey wanted poster and says wanted in the county of Dade. I mean, it's a classic. It's outlaw Jim Morrison. It's a kind of an American archetype as old as our nation, you know?
For sure. I mean, right next to the poster of Johnny Cash, like flipping the bird.
That's another example. Again, sort of like more on in the Waylon Jennings kind of lineage of a man who's you know, might take pills but doesn't like smoke weed. You know what I mean? Like is a kind of more kind of like American country trucker vibe.
I'm out Jamaica in my midnight train. Yeah. Come down the back door, man.
One thing that's curious to me, and that I certainly feel, and that I'm curious to hear what you guys, gals, think about, is what is it like for a woman, listener, viewer, like ourselves, whether as a younger girl or like later on or like now, to listen and look at someone like Jim Morrison? Like, how do I insert myself into kind of the legacy of the Doors, if that makes sense? Like, am I just there to be kind of like a desiring fan as kind of a heterosexual woman? Or would I have been able to have like a conversation with Jim Morrison? Like, if were I a musician, would I have been able to play with him? You know, Natalie, you're a musician. I don't know if that's even a question that's ever occurred to you, but do you know what I'm saying?
No, I
mean,
wanted to play with Ravi Krieger. He's kicking. He's around.
Is that something that might happen, or that like?
I mean, depending on timing, we were going to do something together, but I think that boomers at that age, they have to cancel things quite frequently because of their health. I miss the Ray Manzarek train.
Yeah, R.I.P. Ray.
I think in general, like, I know for a fact that I would have a great hang with Jim.
Really?
I just know. Just
Okay.
I mean, I think that he could speak to women. I don't think he was just full-blown incapable of intellectual conversation with women or something. I do think that he had a soul and an intellect that any singer, any poet, any songwriter could sit down with him and have a good chat. I think that he is a deep guy. And I've imagined that hang, and I think it would have been cool. I feel a bit like a crooner myself, and I know that Jim really liked Peggy Lee. So I feel like we would have related on the schlock. You know, we could have talked about schlock singers and, you know, kind of getting in its own.
Smooth,
Yeah.
the smoothness of the croon and the,
But yeah, I don't know if those guys were like jamming with gals, but
How do you imagine, like, what would you talk to Jim about?
I would talk to him about William Blake. I would talk to him about, you know, dreams, the subconscious, just all the fun stuff. He just seems so fun.
What do you think of yourself as a human being in relation to first yourself and then to other people?
I think of myself as an intelligent, sensitive human being with the soul of a clown. which always forces me to blow it at the most important moments.
Surprise the end.
And I am also a huge fan of Nico, and I know Nico had an incredible experience with him where they took acid together and decided they were brother and sister and just had this incredible whatever moment. And she does such a brilliant cover of The End. There obviously is a soul coalescence between them.
Can you picture what will be?
So I knew that he had respect for female artists and singers. That counterculture lives on. It's a long time ago, but it's also not that long ago. So being a musician now is obviously a completely different landscape and world, but I think a lot of the sentiments are shared, especially when it comes to poetry.
Yeah. Amanda, what do you think about kind of like the idea of being a female fan to someone like Morrison and feeling maybe like, okay, I have a role as a fan, but do I have a role as a person? If that makes sense. Do you know?
Right.
I mean?
Yeah. Yes. I
Yeah.
do. I know what you mean. When I was a kid, when I was like maybe 12 or 13 years old, I had that sort of famous poster of Jim Morrison where he's in the leather pants and he's shirtless and he's wearing like the love beads and his hair looks amazing.
The one with the arms or the one with he's like half profile? Do I look like him? I'm
great
turning
question.
towards the camera. Yeah.
You're nailing it.
Yeah.
I had that poster on the ceiling of my bedroom, which my parents must have just found hilarious. Like I used to go to sleep like gazing at this grown man. It's very funny to me now, but I think because I first sort of connected with the band in that way, my own sort of nascent sexuality or whatever was just beginning to emerge. It is funny. It's complicated to kind of find a way in as an adult where I am no longer attracted to Jim Morrison. It turns out it's not my type. I didn't know that at 12 or 13. But it is weird. It's sort of like, how do I get into this music? How do I sort of find a way in that's not rooted in libido? Or, which I think my first encounter with the Doors was maybe sort of rooted in finding this guy incredibly mysterious and alluring and complicated. How do I engage with this as sort of a grown woman who does not want to sleep with Jim Morrison? It's complicated. My relationship with the Doors is complicated. And I think my brain has been sort of hardwired, maybe sort of against my will a bit by some of the antagonistic feelings towards this band over the years. If you like the Stooges, you can't possibly like the Doors. I mean, the thing that Natalie sort of diffused right when we first started talking, that, that those things are somehow in a diametrical
because the Stooges are like
opposition.
Cool and kind of like punk, and the Doors are like corny.
Corny. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, that the Stooges are sort of authentic and real and raw and intense. And the Doors are corny and whatever. And, yes, that those two things exist as a binary. And I had to, pick a team.
Can we talk about the corny for a second?
Yes, please.
Yeah.
Can we talk about the corny?
Because I have ideas about this, and it goes back to that word schlock that I really love. But I think when you think about like an Anton LaVey or like somebody that's tapping into some weird satanic dark energy in the 50s and how that pushes into the culture over time, I would say there's definitely a lineage with Jim with the kind of schlock singers. And I think this is kind of something that happens in culture. It's like the pioneers of a certain culture might be influenced by something that's older, and in some ways he was influenced by something that was older and quote unquote cheesier compared to like the way rock and roll eventually shook out. And so in some ways, I think where people get the corny from is that it's just kind of an older soul who's like, I'm going to, sing this poem that I wrote over this kind of dramatic, like slightly cinematic, weird, almost bluesy music. And the confluence of the decades and different energies and time in that moment, I think, you could look at Anton LaVey and be like, that's corny. That dude's wearing devil horns and looks cheesy. That's corny. But it's like at the time, that was insane, So I think that some of that corniness comes from like an inability to interpret history in its nuances. And I think maybe people are disappointed that the Doors kind of straddle that line between this older world and this extremely new world.
You know, you said cinematic music, but it's really, I think what it is a kind of like theatricality, right? I
Totally.
mean, the sort of cabaret kind of like,
Vaudeville.
here I am, vaudeville or like Weimar or something, you know, here I am on stage, you know, with my whiskey bottle.
Yeah, and my poem, like.
And my poem.
It's a poem. It's not lyrics. You know, it's kind of like a poem.
Yeah.
In like a way
It's
that
a
some
poem.
people might be like, ugh, it's like doesn't work for me.
Indians scattered on dawn's highway bleeding. Ghosts crowd the young child's fragile eggshell mind. Blood in the streets in the town.
It's interesting because on the one hand, it's absolutely corny and very not like, okay, Iggy, I'm just gonna like carve my chest with like a knife on stage. It's like, on the other hand, it's kind of the same thing in a way. You know, it's kind of like I'm gonna put up a spectacle, and in some senses, a spectacle of a certain kind of masculinity. You know, and it's no coincidence, I think, that both of them had this sort of like leather pants, no shirt, maybe like a chain, long floppy hair, just like thing going for them, you know?
Yeah. I think there's so much overlapping in the presentation. I think where they diverge is in the music. I mean, that the Stooges were so aggressive. It's not that easy to listen to the Stooges. It's actually quite easy to listen to the Doors. You know what I mean? And I say that with love and admiration.
Yeah.
You know, those songs go down a lot easier. And I think that was part of it too. Like, tangled up in our ideas of our authenticity is this idea that the more sort of challenging or difficult or, you know, violent a music is, that somehow makes it kind of more real or more powerful. I think in addition to what you guys were talking about, that sort of history and schmaltz, there's also something very new agey about the Doors, something kind of witchy, you know, the sort of crystals and incense kind of thing. In fact, if I'm remembering this right, I believe the band even formed in like a transcendental meditation class, right? Like, it's rooted in that very California 60s sort of spiritualism. I mean, that's interesting too, in terms of this idea of performance. And like, I think, Nomi, you used the word incantation, this almost sort of conjuring, this almost kind of religious element to the shows. Yeah, that's a fascinating piece of it for me too.
I'm wondering, like, what is kind of the lineage of Jim? Do you think that the kind of like indie rock irony is kind of like made this kind of front man not as viable, possibly?
You can look at someone like Harry Styles, who I think is also a student of Morrison's in a way, but is maybe missing the demons, right? Like, there's
no darkness,
Yeah, right?
Yeah.
It's hard for me to think of a contemporary rock frontman that is doing that same thing. I mean, that's why I mentioned Maddie Healy before, who's not a good, it was just the only name.
No, I mean, that is relatively close.
I think so too.
Just shows where we're at.
Yeah. Where it's like you smoke a cigarette on stage and already it's like you're like shooting up in your eyeball or something. Yeah.
And he's like eating a raw steak. He's, you know, whatever. He's like fucking with America's sweetheart.
I mean, it's like, it's kind of good and kind of bad, maybe. It's certainly a different time, is what I would say.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I think also like Gen X, had such, if I could interpret it, almost like a level of insecurity in that they were never going to dethrone the boomers in terms of their legendary legacy rock status. And so why even try? And so in some way, the anti-hero kind of became a much bigger, more meaningful kind of frontman for, I think, Gen X, which I think is kind of led into, you know, eventually there being more space for women. And now I think it's a predominantly female situation. There's still plenty of men making music, but I don't know if we have that kind of like the same energy in terms of like the forerunners of music being, you know, men that are like shedding some skin and becoming, you know, rebellious and erotic because of it. It's kind of like a rehashment and kind of like paying homage to something before, but it's like not something I've seen made into something new, you know?
No, I love that. And I think I love the Gen X and Boomer kind of like, I'm not even going to try kind of like insecurity that leads to a rejection. But also what you're saying, Natalie, is really interesting to me. The idea that the lack of an ability to create new models for what a male frontman is has allowed more women to enter the space. And I'm curious about yourself as a performer when you appear on stage, or your kind of like persona that you've crafted for yourself as a performer. Do you kind of pull from various models that also include something like Morrison, or because it's kind of your gender, it's something that you don't even think about or don't even consider?
As a low-voiced woman, yeah, I pull from Morrison for sure. But as somebody that's like, I didn't become, successful in my music until my 30s. So in some ways, I missed that window of being this kind of like nubile. I guess I could have pushed it, but it just never felt like my sexuality was going to be my greatest form of poetic expression. And I think it's different for other women. So I don't know if I could draw any kind of line of significance between, going on stage and trying to do the sexy thing. But what I do is definitely, in terms of the poet sense, is the same. I definitely draw a lot of inspiration from him. And while we're talking about this, I forgot about Father John Misty, who to me actually,
Good call.
I think,
good call.
Father Josh
Yeah.
is the closest kind of...
Father Josh.
Yes, Josh Tillman is the closest kind of Morrison energy that would make sense in the 21st century, which is that there is something incredibly sexy about his irony and his intellect and the apathy and the lyrics and the crooning. It's all there, but it's he's so much more self-aware. You can't do that and
That's the
be
thing,
unself-aware
right?
now. So I think that was
That's
something
the
I
thing.
forgot about, but I think he is worth mentioning in the modern Jim conversation.
I live uptown. I live downtown.
Amanda, as someone who often interviews and works with frontmen, I mean, just recently you profiled Mac DeMarco. I know you've worked at length with Lindsey Buckingham. I could go on. One of Tricks Point Never. There's a big range of kind of male frontman musicians that you've worked with. Is kind of like the persona of a Jim type musician or frontman something that ever comes to you as something you need to contend with when you work?
That's interesting. I feel like I engage with so few of my and Iggy Pop is someone I've profiled.
Yes. Oh my God, you profiled Iggy, of course.
Yeah, it's tragically something I feel like I rarely engage with, which speaks to a million different things. Problems with the way that we write about women versus the way we write about men. The question of their sexuality and sort of how it presents itself on stage and kind of in the world at large. I feel like it's so rarely like an essential thread of our conversations, which is fucked up, right? Because they are public facing. I mean, with someone like Lindsey Buckingham, I think more so. With someone like Mac DeMarco, almost not at all, which is
almost the opposite
which is
in a way.
interesting.
But I would argue
Yeah.
that with Mac, in a lot of ways, that's just, it does have a similar kind of craze on the kids, where the kids are definitely losing their shit for Mac.
Oh my God. I saw him at Radio City a few weeks ago, and it was bananas. I mean, he and I got together just to say hi before the show, and the line of kids around the block, 6th Avenue, going down whatever 50th Street, just hundreds and hundreds of kids, and walking outside with him and seeing. I mean, I've walked down the street in New York as part of my job as a professional obligation with quite a few famous people, and to see the way that people went nuts, asking for a picture, they were just sort of losing their minds to see him. And of course, he's someone who really performs. I mean, he's up there, and it's really funny, and it's weird, and it's full of surprises. But the sexual element feels less, a little bit less maybe central to it. It's funny, we were talking about this earlier. I'm in the midst of writing a piece about D'Angelo, who very sadly passed away recently, and he was someone who I think was subjected to sort of willingly to, the kind of dehumanization and sort of over-sexualization that women are very routinely subjected to, especially in pop music. And it's interesting, and I think it destroyed him in many ways, and he, even though he participated in it willingly, like later really recoiled from it and found it horrifying. And it made me think, like, well, men are just not trained. I mean, women are sort of from the birth, kind of trained to sort of hold and bear that, our own dehumanization. Men are not, which is interesting when we think about kind of what happened to Jim Morrison, which is a sad story and a sad end. And I think the way in which women are sort of culturally accustomed to just kind of bearing it is different. I think it's maybe harder for men. They don't have the training, and it can be hard.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely your point about the difference between men and women, and women's kind of like relative nonchalance or expectation of being dehumanized or objectified is well taken. I mean, I think that's totally true. And both for men and for women, this is a very, very broad statement, but obviously gains and losses in this position of object, and the trick of being able to be both an object and a subject is what it's about, I guess, like when you are this sort of figure.
Yeah, I don't know if it was good for Jim Morrison in the end, right? I mean, not to sort of speculate on what, I think he was very obviously an addict and there were other issues at play, but I don't know. I don't know if it's good for anybody.
Yeah, no, fame, I think even sexualization aside, fame in general is definitely does a number on somebody's psyche.
I want to ask you guys the question that we are asking all of our guests. And I think I already know the answer, at least from Natalie, but are the Doors cool? Are the Doors cool? Are they a cool band?
I mean, I would argue that they're one of the coolest bands. I think they are so cool. And you just have to do a little digging to find that out, and a little contextualization.
Amanda, what's your take?
Yeah, I think the Doors are cool. I think the culture, by and large, thinks that the Doors are deeply uncool.
Okay,
however,
fair.
I'm curious if that legacy will evolve, but I don't think it has yet. Okay.
Guys, you guys were awesome. Thank you. You guys are like smart and this was really good. And I'm thankful for both of you for being here.
It's been fun. Thanks for having us.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, I'm really psyched about it.
Me too. Love talking about our brother, Jim.
I know your deepest secret fear. I'm a spy.
Thanks for listening to Really? The Doors? Our executive producers are Noah Chernin and Jody Avirgan, and Ian Wheeler at Talkhouse. Thanks to Jake Bowman and Keenan Kush for production support. Thanks again to our sponsor, Bootleg. I'm Nomi Fry. You can check out my writing at The New Yorker, and I appear weekly on the New Yorker podcast, Critics at Large, where they mute my mic when I start singing the end. See you next time!
No more money, no more fancy dress. This other kingdom seems by far the best, until its other jaw reveals incest and loose obedience to a vegetable law. I will not go. Prefer a feast of friends to a giant family.